The autumn wind swept through the streets of Bozeman, Montana, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. October 2010 had arrived with a chill that settled deep into the bones of the town's residents, a cold that seemed to mirror the unease spreading through the community like a contagion no one wanted to acknowledge. Detective Sarah Brennan stood in the parking lot of Montana State University, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. At 42, she had seen her share of difficult cases during her 15 years with the Bozeman Police Department, but nothing had prepared her for what was about to unfold in this quiet college town of 60,000 souls. The call had come in at 6:17 that morning. A maintenance worker named Tom Henderson had arrived early to prepare the biology building for the day's classes when he noticed something odd: a student's backpack abandoned near the northeast entrance, its contents scattered across the wet pavement as if dropped in haste. What made Tom's hands shake as he dialed 911 wasn't just the backpack itself, but the single shoe lying 10 feet away, and the smear of what looked like blood on the building's brick exterior. Sarah approached the scene with her partner, Detective Marcus Webb, a 38-year-old transplant from Seattle who had moved to Montana seeking a quieter life. The irony wasn't lost on either of them as they ducked under the yellow crime scene tape that now cordoned off the area. "Backpack belongs to Emily Richardson, 19 years old, sophomore majoring in environmental science," Marcus said, reading from his notepad. His dark eyes scanned the scene with practiced efficiency. "Roommate reported her missing at 11 p.m. last night when she didn't return from her study group." Sarah knelt beside the backpack, careful not to disturb the evidence markers already placed by the forensics team. Inside, she could see textbooks, a laptop, a wallet with the student ID still inside, $23 in cash, credit cards untouched. "Not a robbery," she murmured. "Never is," Marcus replied grimly. The forensics photographer, a meticulous woman named Janet Reeves, was documenting every angle of the scene. "Detective Brennan, you're going to want to see this," she called out, gesturing toward the shoe. Sarah walked over, her boots crunching on scattered gravel. The shoe, a white Nike sneaker, women's size 7, sat at an unnatural angle, but it was what Janet pointed to that made Sarah's stomach tighten. A partial footprint in the mud nearby, much larger than the sneaker, possibly a men's size 11 or 12, and next to it, barely visible in the morning light, tire tracks cutting through the grass toward the service road that ran behind the building. "Someone was in a hurry," Sarah observed. "Get casts of everything. I want to know what kind of vehicle made those tracks and what brand of shoes left that print." Tom Henderson, the maintenance worker who had discovered the scene, sat on a nearby bench, still visibly shaken. Sarah approached him gently, recognizing the signs of shock in his trembling hands and pale complexion. "Tom, I know this is difficult, but I need you to walk me through exactly what you saw when you arrived this morning." Tom looked up, his weathered face creased with worry. He had worked at the university for 23 years and knew these buildings like the back of his hand. "I got here at 6, same as always. Park in my usual spot by the loading dock. When I came around the corner with my equipment cart, that's when I saw the backpack. At first I thought maybe some kid just forgot it, you know? Happens all the time. But then I saw how everything was scattered and that shoe and..." He paused, swallowing hard. "That's when I saw the blood on the wall. Just a little smear, maybe 4 inches long, right there by the door handle, like someone grabbed it with a bloody hand." Sarah made notes, her pen moving swiftly across the page. "Did you see or hear anything unusual when you arrived? Any vehicles leaving the area? Anyone walking nearby?" Tom shook his head. "Nothing. It was dead quiet. That's what made it so creepy, you know? This campus is never this quiet, even early in the morning. There's always someone jogging or early students heading to the library, but today, nothing." As Tom spoke, Sarah's radio crackled to life. It was Lieutenant Dan Morrison from the station. "Brennan, we've got something from Richardson's roommate. The study group Emily attended last night? She left at 9:30 p.m., told her friends she was walking back to the dorms. The biology building is directly on that route. No one's seen her since." Sarah exchanged a look with Marcus. The timeline was beginning to form. "Copy that, Lieutenant. We're processing the scene now. Any security camera footage from campus?" There was a pause. Then Morrison's voice came back, tinged with frustration. "That's the problem. The cameras covering this section of campus have been malfunctioning for the past week. Maintenance ticket was filed, but the repairs hadn't been completed yet. We've got nothing." Of course they didn't. Sarah had learned long ago that investigations rarely came with convenient evidence gift-wrapped and ready to solve. "All right, We'll work with what we have. I want officers canvassing every building within a half-mile radius. Someone saw something. As the morning progressed, the university campus transformed from a crime scene into a hive of controlled chaos. Students arriving for early classes were redirected, their curious stares and whispered conversations, creating a buzz of anxiety that spread rapidly. By 9 a.m., the university president had issued a campus-wide alert, warning students to travel in groups and report any suspicious activity immediately. Sarah and Marcus spent the next several hours interviewing Emily's friends, professors, and classmates. A picture began to emerge of a bright, dedicated student who loved the outdoors and dreamed of working in conservation. She was popular, had no known enemies, wasn't involved in any drama or conflicts. By all accounts, Emily Richardson was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Sarah's instincts, honed by years of investigation, told her this was more than a random act. The staging of the scene, the scattered belongings, the single shoe, the blood smear, all suggested something deliberate, almost theatrical. Someone wanted this to be noticed. By late afternoon, as gray clouds rolled in from the mountains threatening snow, Sarah and Marcus regrouped at the police station. The building, a modest two-story structure on North Rouse Avenue, hummed with activity as officers coordinated search efforts throughout the surrounding wilderness areas. "I pulled Emily's phone records," Marcus said, spreading printouts across Sarah's desk. Last activity was at 9:42 p.m., a text to her mother saying goodnight. Phone went dead immediately after, either powered off or destroyed. The last ping came from a cell tower that covers the area near the biology building, which confirms she was where she said she'd be. Sarah studied the records, her mind working through possibilities. What about her social media? Any concerning messages, followers, interactions? Clean. Her accounts are typical college student stuff. Photos with friends, environmental advocacy posts, studying complaints. Nothing that raises red flags. Marcus leaned back in his chair, frustration evident in his posture. It's like she just vanished into thin air. But people didn't vanish into thin air. Someone had taken Emily Richardson, and that someone had left traces, however small. Sarah knew that solving this case would require patience, methodical investigation, and perhaps a bit of luck. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she sat in that office watching the first snowflakes of the season drift past the window, was that Emily Richardson's disappearance was only the beginning. 3 days later, as search parties combed the foothills of the Bridger Mountains, Sarah received another call. This time it was from campus security. Another student had failed to return home after an evening jog. Her name was Ashley Morrison, 20 years old, a junior studying biochemistry. Her running shoes, identified by the distinctive pink laces her mother had given her for good luck, had been found abandoned on a trail in the Gallatin National Forest, just 15 miles from where Emily Richardson's backpack had been discovered. Sarah stood in her kitchen that evening, unable to eat the dinner she'd prepared, staring at the caseboard she'd set up in her home office. 2 young women, both students, both vanished without witnesses, both last seen in areas with convenient camera blind spots or malfunctioning equipment. This wasn't coincidence, this was hunting. And somewhere in Bozeman, Montana, beneath the shadow of the mountains and the veneer of academic respectability, a predator had found his hunting ground. Sarah picked up her phone and called Marcus. "We need to go back through every detail of both scenes tomorrow, every witness statement, every piece of evidence, because whoever's doing this isn't going to stop at 2. As she hung up, Sarah walked to her window and looked out at the quiet residential street, at the homes with their warm lights glowing against the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, families were going to sleep believing their daughters were safe at college, pursuing dreams and building futures. Sarah knew better. She had seen too much, investigated too many cases where evil wore ordinary faces and monsters looked like neighbors. And as the snow began to fall more heavily, blanketing Bozeman in white, she made herself a promise. She would find these young women, and she would find whoever had taken them, no matter how long it took or where the investigation led. What Sarah didn't realize as she stood at that window in October 2010 was that it would take 12 years, advancements in DNA technology she couldn't yet imagine, and the obsessive dedication of a detective who refused to let the case die before the truth would finally emerge from the shadows. And when it did, that truth would shake the community of Bozeman to its very foundation. The winter of 2010 descended upon Bozeman with a vengeance that matched the darkness settling over the community. By mid-November, the The search for Emily Richardson and Ashley Morrison had expanded to cover over 200 square miles of wilderness, involving state police, FBI consultants, and volunteer search parties that numbered in the hundreds. Yet despite the massive effort, not a single substantial lead had emerged. Detective Sarah Brennan sat in the conference room at the Bozeman Police Department, surrounded by whiteboards covered in timelines, photographs, and maps marked with red pins indicating the last known locations of the missing women. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the tired faces of the task force assembled to work the case. "Let's go through what we know," Sarah said, standing before the group of 8 officers and detectives. Her voice carried the weight of sleepless nights and mounting pressure from both the university administration and the mayor's office. Emily Richardson, 19, disappeared October 14th between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Ashley Morrison, 20, disappeared October 27th between 7 and 8 p.m. Both were Montana State students. Both vanished during evening hours. Both were last seen in areas where security cameras were either non-functional or poorly positioned. Marcus Webb stood and pointed to a map of the campus and surrounding area. "We've identified a pattern in the camera malfunctions. The biology building cameras went offline October 10th, 4 days before Emily disappeared. The trail camera system near Gallatin National Forest, which should have captured anyone entering or leaving the area where Ashley's shoes were found, experienced a power failure on October 25th, 2 days before she vanished." A young officer named Derek Chen raised his hand. "Are we treating the camera issues as sabotage?" The university's IT department claims the biology building cameras failed due to a software update gone wrong, Sarah replied, her tone suggesting she didn't fully believe this explanation. "The Forest Service says the trail camera failure was due to weather damage, but the timing is too convenient. I've requested a full forensic analysis of both systems." FBI Special Agent Linda Torres, on loan from the field office in Salt Lake City, leaned forward. She was a specialist in serial predatory behavior, and her presence indicated how seriously the Bureau was taking the case. "Detective Brennan, have we established any connection between the 2 victims beyond their enrollment at MSU?" Sarah nodded to Marcus, who pulled up a presentation on the laptop connected to the overhead projector. "We've been analyzing their schedules, social circles, and activities. On the surface, Emily and Ashley had very different lives. Emily was outdoorsy, involved in environmental clubs, mostly hung out with a small group of close friends. Ashley was more social, belonged to a sorority, had a wider circle of acquaintances. They didn't share any classes, weren't in any of the same organizations, and as far as we can determine, didn't know each other personally. But," Sarah interjected, pulling up a new slide, "we found one interesting overlap. Both young women frequented the university's Strand Union Building coffee shop. Emily went there almost daily to study. Ashley met friends there several times a week. The shop is centrally located, high foot traffic, popular with students and faculty alike." Agent Torres made a note. "So our offender could be someone who had access to observe both victims in a public, neutral space where his presence wouldn't raise suspicion." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "We've pulled the work schedules for all coffee shop employees, reviewed hundreds of hours of security footage from the building, which conveniently does work, and we're compiling a list of regular customers, particularly male individuals who appear frequently during times when both victims were present." The investigation was producing mountains of data but frustratingly few actionable leads. Sarah and her team had interviewed over 300 people, students, faculty, staff, local residents. They'd examined Emily's laptop and phone, finding nothing unusual. Ashley's devices remained missing, likely taken by whoever had abducted her. As November bled into December, the case began to consume Sarah's every waking moment. She drove through Bozeman streets at odd hours, studying the routes the victims might have taken, trying to understand the geography through a predator's eyes. The town, which had always felt safe and welcoming, now seemed full of shadows and potential hiding places. One evening, as snow fell heavily outside her office window, Sarah received a call from Janet Reeves, the forensics expert who had been processing evidence from both crime scenes. "Detective, I think I found something." Janet's voice carried a note of cautious excitement. "I've been analyzing the soil samples from where we found Ashley's running shoes. The composition doesn't match the trail where they were discovered." Sarah felt a jolt of adrenaline. "Explain." "The shoes had soil embedded in the treads that contains a specific mineral composition, high levels of limestone and bentonite clay. This type of soil is found in certain areas of the Bridger Mountains, but not in the Gallatin National Forest where the shoes were located. Someone moved those shoes, Detective. They weren't left where Ashley was taken. This was the first piece of evidence suggesting their offender was sophisticated enough to stage scenes and mislead investigators. Sarah immediately convened an emergency meeting with the task force. Our subject is organized and intelligent, Agent Torres explained to the group, updating her behavioral profile. He's comfortable with planning and manipulation. The camera malfunctions, the staged evidence, these indicate someone with technical knowledge and patience. He's likely educated, possibly works in a field requiring attention to detail. The fact that he's targeting university students suggests he's comfortable in that environment, might even be part of it in some capacity. We need to expand our suspect pool to include faculty and staff, Sarah said, though the suggestion made her uncomfortable. The idea that a trusted member of the university community could be responsible felt like a betrayal of everything the institution represented. Over the next 2 weeks, detectives quietly interviewed professors, administrators, janitors, security guards, and graduate students. They looked for individuals with access to the buildings and systems that had been compromised, those with knowledge of campus security protocols, anyone with a history of inappropriate behavior toward students. One name kept appearing in their research: Dr. Robert Harding, a 42-year-old professor of biology who had been teaching at Montana State for 8 years. Several students mentioned him as being particularly popular, known for his engaging lectures and willingness to help students outside of class. He frequently worked late in his office, was often seen around campus at odd hours conducting research. But when Sarah and Marcus interviewed Dr. Harding in his office on a cold afternoon in mid-December, nothing about him raised immediate red flags. He was professional, cooperative, and genuinely seemed distressed about the missing students. Emily Richardson was in my Ecology 101 class last spring, Dr. Harding said, his office walls lined with academic texts and specimen jars containing preserved samples. He was of average height and build, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. She was a good student, very passionate about conservation. I wrote her a recommendation letter for a summer internship. When I heard she'd gone missing, I was devastated. "And Ashley Morrison?" Marcus asked, watching the professor's reactions carefully. "I didn't know her personally, but I'm familiar with the biochemistry program. This whole situation has the entire faculty on edge. We're supposed to be protecting these students, creating a safe environment for learning." Dr. Harding's voice carried genuine emotion. "Is there anything I can do to help? Any way I can assist with the investigation?" Sarah studied him, looking for the tells she'd learned to recognize over her career, the micro-expressions that betrayed deception, the body language that suggested guilt. She saw only concern and a desire to help. "If you think of anything unusual you might have noticed around campus, anyone acting strangely or asking inappropriate questions about students, please contact us immediately." As they left his office, Marcus turned to Sarah. "What do you think?" "I think he's either genuinely concerned or an excellent actor," Sarah replied, troubled by her inability to read him clearly. "Add him to the list of people we're keeping tabs on, but don't prioritize him. Something about this feels too obvious." Christmas came and went with no breaks in the case. The families of Emily Richardson and Ashley Morrison spent the holidays in anguish, clinging to hope while fearing the worst. Sarah worked through the holiday, unable to celebrate while 2 young women remained missing. Then on January 4th, 2011, everything changed. A pair of cross-country skiers discovered Emily Richardson's body in a remote area of the Bridger Mountains, partially buried under snow in a shallow ravine approximately 40 miles northeast of Bozeman. The location was so isolated that it had been missed during initial search efforts, accessible only by a rarely used logging road that had been snowed over for weeks. Sarah stood at the scene as the medical examiner's team carefully excavated the body, her heart heavy with the weight of failure. Emily had been dead for months, likely killed shortly after her abduction. The cold had preserved the body reasonably well, which would help with the forensic examination, but Sarah knew this case had just transformed from a missing persons investigation into a homicide. Dr. Patricia Chen, the medical examiner, conducted a preliminary examination at the scene before the body was transported. "Significant trauma to the head," she reported to Sarah, her voice clinically detached in the way medical professionals learn to cope with tragedy. "I'll know more after the autopsy, but initial assessment suggests she was struck multiple times with a blunt object. Death was likely not immediate, but would have occurred within hours. Sarah felt rage building beneath her professional composure. Emily Richardson had suffered. She had known terror and pain before dying alone in these mountains. And somewhere the person responsible was going about his life, perhaps already planning his next move. The discovery of Emily's body intensified the search for Ashley Morrison. If Emily had been killed and dumped in such a remote location, Ashley might be out there somewhere too, waiting to be found. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment swept the mountains. Ground teams expanded their search radius. The entire state seemed mobilized in the effort. 3 weeks later, on January 26th, Ashley Morrison's body was discovered by a rancher checking his property line in a different section of the Bridger Mountains, approximately 30 miles from where Emily had been found. Like Emily, Ashley had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head. Like Emily, she had been hidden in a location that suggested intimate knowledge of the area's geography. The autopsies revealed additional disturbing details. Both women had been held alive for several hours after their abductions before being killed. Both showed signs of having been bound at the wrists and ankles. Both had trace evidence, fibers, soil samples, and other microscopic materials that forensics was working to analyze. But no DNA was recovered from the bodies beyond that of the victims themselves. Their killer had been careful, meticulous in avoiding leaving biological evidence. Sarah sat in her office late one night, staring at the photographs of Emily and Ashley, bright young women with their whole lives ahead of them, now reduced to case numbers and evidence logs. The weight of their deaths pressed down on her, a burden she knew she would carry for the rest of her career. Her phone rang, Marcus's number on the display. "We've got the trace evidence analysis back from the lab," he said without preamble. Fibers found on both bodies match automotive carpet typically used in Ford vehicles manufactured between 2005 and 2010. The soil samples contain that same limestone bentonite composition Janet identified earlier. And Sarah, they found something else. Microscopic particles of laboratory-grade chalk, the kind used in science classrooms and laboratories. Sarah felt the pieces beginning to align. Someone with access to a relatively new Ford vehicle and a science laboratory. Someone familiar enough with the Bridger Mountains to know remote disposal sites. "We need to look harder at the university faculty," Marcus said, echoing her thoughts. "Someone who teaches in the sciences. Someone who fits the profile." As January turned to February, the investigation took on new urgency. The task force created a detailed matrix of potential suspects, cross-referencing vehicle ownership, building access, teaching schedules, and dozens of other variables. Names rose and fell on their priority list as evidence either supported or eliminated them as persons of interest. And through it all, Dr. Robert Harding remained a peripheral figure, helpful when contacted, concerned about campus safety, but never quite emerging as a primary suspect despite checking several boxes on their profile. He drove a 2008 Ford Explorer. He had unlimited access to biology laboratories. He knew the local mountains well from his ecological research, but so did 24 other faculty members who also remained under quiet investigation. Sarah refused to narrow her focus prematurely, remembering cases that had gone wrong when detectives became tunnel-visioned on a single suspect. What Sarah didn't know as winter gave way to an early spring in 2011 was that their investigation had been noticed. Someone was watching them work, observing their methods, learning their patterns, and that someone had already begun planning how to continue his work while staying invisible in plain sight. The game had only just begun. The spring semester of 2011 brought an uneasy calm to Montana State University. Students walked in groups, campus security patrols doubled, and self-defense classes filled to capacity. The murders of Emily Richardson and Ashley Morrison had transformed Bozeman from a peaceful college town into a community haunted by fear and suspicion. Detective Sarah Brennan spent those months drowning in evidence that led nowhere. The task force had interviewed over 700 individuals, processed thousands of pieces of evidence, and followed up on more than 2,000 tips called in by concerned citizens. Yet the killer remained a ghost, leaving just enough trace evidence to prove he existed but not enough to identify him. By late April, the pressure from the mayor's office and university administration had reached a breaking point. Parents were withdrawing their daughters from the school. Enrollment applications for the fall semester had dropped by 30%. The university's reputation, built over decades, was crumbling under the weight of unsolved murders. Lieutenant Dan Morrison called Sarah into his office on a gray Tuesday afternoon. He looked exhausted, his usually neat desk covered in folders and coffee cups. "The FBI wants to take over the case," he said without preamble. "Agent Torres has been reporting back to her superiors and they think we're out of our depth." Sarah felt anger flash through her. "We've been working this case night and day for 6 months. We know this community, these people." "I know," Morrison interrupted, raising a hand. "I fought them on it. Told them you're the best detective I've got, that giving up now would be a mistake. But Sarah, they're not wrong about one thing. We need fresh eyes. We need resources we don't have. The Bureau has forensic capabilities, databases, and behavioral analysts that could make the difference." Sarah sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk. She knew he was right, even as every instinct rebelled against the idea of handing over her case. "What did you tell them?" "That we'd work together. Joint task force. Bureau provides resources and expertise, but you remain the lead investigator." They agreed, but Sarah... Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious. "They're also talking about the possibility that our suspect has gone dormant, that he might not strike again for months or years or ever. They want to prepare for this becoming a cold case." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Cold case. The two words every detective dreaded. The admission that despite their best efforts, justice would be delayed, possibly forever. "I won't let that happen," she said quietly. But by the end of May, as the semester concluded and students dispersed for summer break, the investigation had indeed begun to cool. The media attention faded. The task force was reduced from 8 officers to 3. Sarah, Marcus, and Agent Torres continued their work, but the momentum had been lost. Then on September 8, 2011, as fall semester began and students returned to campus, the nightmare resumed. Her name was Jessica Palmer, 21 years old, a senior majoring in chemistry with dreams of attending medical school. She disappeared after leaving the library at 9:40 p.m., her car found abandoned in the parking garage with her purse and phone inside, keys still in the ignition. The engine was running, driver's side door open, as if she'd been pulled from the vehicle mid-departure. The crime scene sent chills through everyone who had worked the previous cases. This time there was no attempt at subtlety or misdirection. This was a statement bold and terrifying in its brazenness. Someone had abducted Jessica Palmer from a well-lit parking garage with security cameras covering every angle. Except when Sarah reviewed the footage, she discovered that the camera covering Jessica's parking spot had experienced a technical glitch at precisely 9:37 p.m., 3 minutes before Jessica's phone last pinged the cell network. The camera came back online at 9:52 p.m., showing Jessica's car abandoned exactly as it had been found. Sarah stood in the parking garage at midnight, long after the forensics team had finished processing the scene. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. She closed her eyes and tried to visualize what had happened. Jessica walking to her car, tired after hours of studying, thinking about her upcoming exams, maybe texting a friend. She gets in, starts the engine, and then what? Someone approaches? Someone she knows, perhaps? Someone who doesn't frighten her initially? "He's escalating," Agent Torres said, appearing at Sarah's side. The FBI agent looked as exhausted as Sarah felt. The previous abductions were careful, planned, executed in locations with plausible deniability. This is confidence bordering on arrogance. He disabled that camera and took her from a public space because he believes he's untouchable. Marcus joined them, holding a forensics report. Tire marks near Jessica's vehicle suggest another car pulled up alongside hers, possibly blocking her in. Commercial-grade van or truck based on the tire width and tread pattern. We're running it through our database, but it's a common type. The investigation exploded back to life with renewed intensity. The FBI brought in additional agents. The state police assigned more resources. Sarah barely slept, running on coffee and determination, interviewing Jessica's friends, family, professors, anyone who might provide a clue. Jessica's roommate, a young woman named Brittany Chen, sat in the interview room with red-rimmed eyes. She was excited about this semester, Brittany said, her voice breaking. She'd just been accepted into a summer research program with Dr. Harding, the biology professor. It was a big deal, competitive position, only 3 students selected. She was supposed to start meeting with him next week to discuss the research project. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Dr. Robert Harding? Yes, he's kind of a legend on campus. Students compete to work with him because his recommendations carry a lot of weight with medical schools. Jessica was thrilled when she got selected. After the interview, Sarah pulled up Dr. Harding's file, which had remained in their database of persons of interest. She reviewed his previous interview, his background check, his movements during the previous abductions. Nothing had eliminated him as a suspect, but nothing had elevated him either. He existed in that frustrating middle ground. Suspicious enough to watch, but not suspicious enough to pursue aggressively. "We need to talk to him again," Sarah told Marcus. "Casually, nothing that suggests we're focusing on him specifically. But I want to know his whereabouts last night, and I want to see how he reacts to news about Jessica." They found Dr. Harding in his laboratory the next morning, working with 2 undergraduate students on what appeared to be a plant genetics experiment. He looked up as Sarah and Marcus entered, his expression shifting from concentration to concern when he recognized them. "Detectives, has something happened?" He removed his latex gloves and dismissed the students, who gathered their materials and left quietly. "We're investigating another disappearance," Sarah said, watching his face carefully. "Jessica Palmer, chemistry major, went missing last night." Dr. Harding's reaction appeared genuinely shocked. He sank into his desk chair, removing his glasses to rub his eyes. "Jessica? No, that can't be. I just selected her for my summer research program. She was here in my office 2 days ago, so excited about the opportunity." He looked up at them, his face pale. "Please tell me this isn't connected to Emily and Ashley." "We don't know yet," Marcus said. "Dr. Harding, where were you last night between 9 and 10 p.m.? "I was here working late. I had a grant proposal deadline and was reviewing research data." He gestured to his computer. "I can show you the files, they're time-stamped. I didn't leave the building until nearly 11. "Was anyone with you who could verify that?" Sarah asked. Dr. Harding thought for a moment. "The janitor, Miguel Ramirez, came through around 9:30 to empty the trash. We talked briefly about the upcoming football game, and Dr. Patricia Walsh from the chemistry department stopped by around 10 to borrow some equipment. She can confirm I was here." The alibis checked out. Miguel Ramirez confirmed seeing Dr. Harding in his office around 9:30. Dr. Walsh verified stopping by at approximately 10 p.m. Security logs showed Dr. Harding's keycard accessing the building exit at 10:53 p.m. But Sarah's instincts, honed by years of investigation, told her something wasn't right. The timing was too perfect, the alibis too convenient, the witnesses too willing to place him exactly where he claimed to be. It felt rehearsed, planned. "Run deep background on Harding," Sarah told Marcus after they left the building. "I want to know everything. Where he worked before MSU, any complaints from students, his financial records, property holdings, everything." Over the next week, as the search for Jessica Palmer intensified, Sarah's team uncovered interesting details about Dr. Robert Harding's past. Before coming to Montana State, he'd taught at 2 other universities, first at a small college in Oregon, then at a larger institution in Colorado. He'd left both positions voluntarily, citing opportunities for advancement, which wasn't unusual in academia. But when Sarah contacted administrators at both previous institutions, she detected a subtle reluctance in their responses. The Oregon College's Dean of Sciences was polite, but brief, saying only that Dr. Harding had been adequate in his position. The Colorado University's department chair was more forthcoming when pressed. "Look, detective, I can't give you specifics without violating privacy policies," the chair said over the phone. "But I can tell you that Dr. Harding left our institution under circumstances that made everyone relieved to see him go. There were never any formal complaints filed, nothing that would show up in an official record, but there were concerns raised by several female students about his behavior." "What kind of concerns?" Sarah pressed. "Inappropriate attention, excessive interest in their personal lives? Nothing overt enough to warrant action, just uncomfortable." When he announced he was leaving for Montana, there was a collective sigh of relief in the department. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was the pattern she'd been searching for, subtle, never quite crossing legal lines, but present nonetheless. A predator learning to hide in plain sight, refining his methods, becoming more careful with each new environment. On September 23rd, 2 weeks after her disappearance, Jessica Palmer's body was found by a forest ranger in yet another remote area of the Bridger Mountains, approximately 25 miles from the previous dump sites. The pattern held: blunt force trauma to the head, evidence of being restrained, held alive for hours before being killed. And once again, the killer had left no DNA evidence. But this time, forensics found something new. Caught in Jessica's hair was a single fiber that didn't match anything from the previous cases. A synthetic material used in specialized laboratory coats, the kind worn in research facilities when working with sensitive biological materials. Sarah immediately requested access to Dr. Harding's laboratory, citing the need to eliminate him from their investigation. With a warrant in hand, forensics swept his office and lab, collecting samples for comparison. The fiber didn't match. The laboratory coats in Harding's facility were a different brand, different material composition. Once again, the evidence seemed to clear him while simultaneously keeping him in the periphery of suspicion. The fall semester progressed under a cloud of fear. Parents demanded action. The university president held weekly press conferences reassuring the public that every measure was being taken to ensure student safety. But behind closed doors, Sarah knew the truth. They were no closer to identifying the killer than they had been a year ago. In November, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. With limited resources and mounting pressure to show results, she recommended that the task force shift focus away from Dr. Harding and toward other potential suspects who had emerged in the investigation. There were at least 4 other individuals: a graduate student with a history of stalking, a campus security guard with a sealed juvenile record, a maintenance supervisor who had been fired from a previous job under questionable circumstances, and a local contractor who worked on campus and owned property in the mountains, who seemed equally or more promising as suspects. Marcus disagreed with the decision. "There's something about Harding," he argued during a heated debate in Sarah's office. "I can't put my finger on it, but my gut says we're missing something. The way he's always just peripheral enough to be noticed but never central enough to be seriously suspected. It feels deliberate." "I know," Sarah admitted, "but we can't justify the resources to surveil him when we have other suspects with more concrete red flags. We'll keep him on the watch list, but we need to pursue these other leads." It was the right decision based on the evidence available. It was the logical professional choice that any experienced detective would make. But it was also, Sarah would later realize, exactly what the killer had been counting on. December arrived with bitter cold and no new breaks in the case. The semester ended. Students left for winter break. The campus fell quiet, and with it, the investigation entered another lull. Sarah spent Christmas alone in her office, surrounded by case files and crime scene photos, unable to shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial, some connection that would make everything suddenly clear. She reviewed every interview, every piece of evidence, every timeline and alibi. Somewhere in this mountain of information was the answer. She just couldn't see it yet. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks exploded over Bozeman and the town celebrated the arrival of 2012, Sarah made a resolution. She would solve this case, no matter how long it took, no matter where the investigation led. 3 young women were dead, their families destroyed, their futures stolen. They deserved justice, and Sarah would not rest until she delivered it. What Sarah couldn't know, as she sat alone in her office that night, was that the killer had made his own resolution. He had been patient, careful, methodical, but now, emboldened by his success at evading detection, he was ready to accelerate his timeline. The game was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and the next victim was already being selected. The winter of 2012 was unusually harsh, even by Montana standards. Temperatures plummeted to 20 below zero, and snowstorms swept through Bozeman with relentless frequency. The extreme weather kept most people indoors, campus attendance dropped, and the investigation into the 3 murders seemed to freeze along with the landscape. Detective Sarah Brennan used the quiet period to re-examine every aspect of the case with obsessive detail. She had requisitioned a dedicated room at the police station that became known among officers as Sarah's War Room. Walls covered floor to ceiling with photographs, maps, timelines, and evidence reports. Red string connected various elements, creating a web of possibilities that grew more complex by the day. Marcus Webb found her there late one evening in mid-January, surrounded by open case files and empty coffee cups. "Sarah, you need to go home. Get some sleep. You've been here for 18 hours straight." She didn't look up from the document she was reading. "Did you know that all 3 victims had changed their course schedules within 2 weeks of their disappearances?" Emily added a biology elective. Ashley switched her organic chemistry lab section. Jessica enrolled in an advanced molecular biology seminar. Marcus pulled up a chair, interested despite his concern for his partner's well-being. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that maybe the connection isn't about who they were, but about what they were doing. What if our killer needed them to be in specific places at specific times? What if the course changes weren't coincidental but engineered somehow? Course registration is online, password protected. How would someone manipulate that without leaving a digital trail?" Sarah finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. What if they didn't need to hack the system? What if they just needed to influence the decisions? A suggested class here, a recommended professor there. Students trust academic advisors, teaching assistants, faculty mentors. They spent the next several days pulling registration records and academic advising logs for all 3 victims. The data revealed that Emily Richardson had changed her schedule after a conversation with her faculty advisor, Dr. Robert Harding, who had suggested the biology elective would strengthen her conservation program application. Ashley Morrison had switched lab sections following a recommendation from a teaching assistant, who turned out to be one of Dr. Harding's graduate students. Jessica Palmer's enrollment in the molecular biology seminar had been encouraged by Dr. Harding himself when he'd selected her for the summer research position. It's circumstantial, Agent Torres cautioned when Sarah presented the findings. Professors and advisors make course recommendations all the time. It's literally part of their job. Any defense attorney would tear this apart. But it establishes a pattern, Sarah insisted. Harding had direct or indirect influence over all 3 victims' schedules in the weeks before they disappeared. That can't be coincidence. The FBI agent considered this carefully. All right, let's say you're right. Let's say Harding is our suspect. What's his motive? These aren't crimes of passion or opportunity. This is organized, methodical. Serial killers usually have some psychological driver. Power, control, sexual gratification. What's his? Sarah had been wrestling with this question for weeks. Dr. Robert Harding's background revealed no obvious trauma, no history of violence, no red flags that typically appeared in serial killer profiles. He was divorced, but the split had been amicable according to his ex-wife, who described him as distant and too focused on his work, but never threatening or abusive. He had no children. His colleagues found him pleasant, if somewhat reserved. Students praised his teaching while occasionally noting he could be intense about his research. Maybe we're looking at this wrong, Marcus suggested. What if it's not about psychology but about opportunity? What if he's killing because he can, because he's smart enough to get away with it, and that's the thrill? Before they could pursue this line of reasoning further, Sarah's phone rang. It was the front desk. Detective Brennan, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent about the university murders. The visitor was a young woman named Amanda Torres, no relation to Agent Torres, a 23-year-old graduate student in the biology department. She sat in the interview room, hands trembling as she clutched a cup of tea Sarah had provided. I don't know if this means anything, Amanda began, her voice barely above a whisper. But after Jessica disappeared, I started thinking about something that happened to me last year, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I should tell someone. Sarah leaned forward, keeping her tone gentle and encouraging. Take your time, Amanda. Whatever you remember could be helpful. I was working late in the lab one night in October 2011, around the time Jessica disappeared. It must have been 9:30 or 10. I was alone, or I thought I was. Dr. Harding came in. He said he'd forgotten some papers he needed. But the thing is, Detective, he seemed surprised to see me there. Really surprised. Almost. Upset about it. Did he say anything threatening? Marcus asked. No, nothing like that. He just seemed off, agitated. He asked me when I was planning to leave, said the building would be locked soon. I told him I'd be another hour at least. He left right after that, but I heard him in his office for a while moving things around. When I finally finished and walked past his office, the door was open and he was gone. But I noticed his calendar on the wall had the date circled. September 8th. That was the night Jessica disappeared. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Did you mention this to anyone at the time? Amanda shook her head. It didn't seem significant then. Professors work weird hours and lots of people circle important dates on calendars. But later, when I really thought about it, I realized that if I hadn't been there that night, the lab would have been empty. And the lab is on the route Jessica would have taken from the library to the parking garage. After Amanda left, Sarah and Marcus sat in silence, the implications settling over them. He's selecting victims based on opportunity windows, Sarah said slowly. Times when he can move around campus without drawing attention, when his presence can be explained by legitimate work activities. If Amanda hadn't been in that lab that night, she might have been victim number 4, Marcus finished grimly. They brought this new information to Lieutenant Morrison and Agent Torres. The FBI agent's skepticism had finally given way to genuine concern. All right, we need to look at this more seriously, but we have to be careful. If Harding is our killer and we tip him off, he could destroy evidence, or worse, accelerate his timeline. We need concrete evidence before we move. The team developed a strategy. They would conduct surveillance on Dr. Harding, discreetly using agents he wouldn't recognize. They would analyze his movements during the times of all 3 abductions, looking for gaps in his alibis that deeper investigation might reveal. They would interview more students and colleagues carefully, without indicating that Harding was their focus. February brought a break in the weather and a break in the case. A forensic accountant reviewing Harding's financial records discovered something unusual. Every 3 months, Harding made a cash withdrawal of exactly $2,000 from his bank account. The withdrawals had been occurring for the past 3 years, always in cash, never explained by any corresponding deposits or purchases that investigators could trace. People who deal in cash are usually hiding something, the accountant explained. Drugs, gambling, payments they don't want traced. In this case, $6,000 a year, disappearing into thin air. Sarah obtained a warrant to review Harding's property records. They discovered he owned more than just his house in Bozeman. 2 years earlier, he'd purchased a small cabin in the Bridger Mountains through an LLC, a detail that hadn't appeared in their initial background check because the property was registered under a business entity rather than his personal name. The cabin's location made Sarah's blood run cold. It was positioned almost exactly equidistant from all 3 body dump sites, accessible via old logging roads that rarely saw traffic. "We need to search that cabin," Sarah told Morrison. "If Harding is our killer, that's where he's taking them. That's where they died." Obtaining a search warrant required probable cause, and their evidence, while compelling, was still largely circumstantial. They needed one more piece, something concrete that would convince a judge. Agent Torres suggested a different approach. "What if we bring him in for a voluntary interview?" she proposed. "Nothing confrontational, just routine follow-up questions. We can assess his behavior. Maybe he'll slip up, give us something we can use." The interview was scheduled for March 5, 2012. Dr. Robert Harding arrived at the police station at 2 p.m., dressed professionally in slacks and a button-down shirt carrying a briefcase. He seemed calm, cooperative, slightly curious about why his presence had been requested again. Sarah and Agent Torres conducted the interview while Marcus watched from behind the 2-way mirror, analyzing every gesture and expression. They started with soft questions. How was the semester going? Any updates on the research program? Had he noticed anything unusual around campus recently? Then Sarah shifted gears. "Dr. Harding, can you tell us about your cabin in the Bridger Mountains?" For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Surprise? Fear? It vanished so quickly Sarah almost doubted she'd seen it. "My cabin? I use it occasionally for field research. It's quiet, away from distractions. Is there a problem? When was the last time you were there?" Agent Torres asked. "I'm not sure exactly. Maybe a month ago. I'd have to check my calendar. Would you mind if we took a look at the property? Just to eliminate it from our investigation. You understand we have to be thorough." Dr. Harding shifted in his chair, the first sign of discomfort he'd shown. "I'm not sure I understand why my cabin would be relevant to your investigation, but I suppose I don't have any objection, though I'd prefer to be present when you conduct the search." "Of course," Sarah said smoothly. "We'll arrange a time that works for everyone." The interview continued for another hour, but they learned nothing new. Harding maintained his composure, answered every question without apparent deception, and left the station with a polite goodbye. But Sarah had seen that momentary crack in his facade, and it was enough. Judge Patricia Williams reviewed their warrant application the next morning. The evidence was thin: the property ownership, the financial irregularities, the circumstantial connections to the victims. It wasn't enough for an arrest warrant, but it was enough for a search. On March 8, 2012, a cold Thursday morning with low clouds threatening snow, a team of investigators approached the cabin in the Bridger Mountains. Dr. Harding met them there, as agreed, his expression carefully neutral. The cabin was small, perhaps 800 square feet, constructed of rough-hewn logs with a metal roof. It looked like thousands of other hunting cabins scattered throughout Montana's wilderness. Unremarkable, forgettable, perfect for someone who wanted privacy. Sarah entered first, her heart pounding despite years of experience that should have inoculated her against such reactions. The main room contained basic furniture: a couch, a chair, a wood stove, a small kitchen area. Everything was neat, almost obsessively clean. Too clean. The forensics team spread out, using luminol to check for blood traces, photographing every surface, collecting samples. Dr. Harding stood outside with 2 officers watching through the window. It was Marcus who found it. In a storage closet off the main room, beneath several boxes of legitimate research materials, was a false floor. Prying it up revealed a space approximately 3 feet deep, accessed by a ladder. Sarah climbed down, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The underground room was roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, the walls reinforced with concrete, and there, on a workbench against the far wall, was evidence that made her stomach turn. Photographs, dozens of them. Emily Richardson, Ashley Morrison, Jessica Palmer. Candid shots taken without their knowledge, tracking their movements, their routines, their lives. But there were also photographs of other young women, students Sarah recognized from campus. Some were marked with dates. Some had red X's drawn through them. And in a locked cabinet, forced open by the forensics team, they found personal items: a bracelet belonging to Emily, Ashley's student ID, Jessica's necklace, trophies, kept as reminders of his kills. Sarah climbed back up, her hands shaking with rage and vindication. She walked outside to where Dr. Harding stood, still maintaining his facade of helpful cooperation. "Dr. Robert Harding, you are under arrest for the murders of Emily Richardson, Ashley Morrison, and Jessica Palmer." Sarah's voice was steady as she read him his rights, though inside she was screaming. This man, this trusted professor, had betrayed every principle of the institution he served. He had used his position to hunt and kill students who had looked up to him, trusted him, never suspecting the monster behind the scholarly facade. Harding said nothing as he was handcuffed and led to a police vehicle. His expression remained neutral, almost blank, as if none of this affected him at all. That absence of emotion was perhaps the most chilling thing Sarah had witnessed in her entire career. The search of the underground room continued for 3 days. Forensics found DNA evidence linking Harding to all 3 victims: hair, skin cells, blood traces he thought he'd cleaned away, but which luminol revealed. They found detailed journals documenting his selection process, his planning, his execution of each murder. He had written about them with the clinical detachment of a scientist recording experimental results. But it was the photographs of other women that haunted Sarah. 12 students whose faces appeared in that collection. Women who had unknowingly been in Harding's crosshairs. Potential future victims saved only by his arrest. Amanda Torres, the graduate student who had come forward, was among them. The date circled on Harding's calendar, September 8th, had been the night he'd planned to take her, foiled only by her unexpected presence in the lab. The case that had consumed Sarah's life for 18 months was finally closed. Dr. Robert Harding was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. Justice, delayed but not denied, would be served. But as Sarah sat in her office that night looking at the photographs of 3 young women whose lives had been stolen, she felt no sense of victory. Justice couldn't bring them back, couldn't undo the trauma inflicted on their families, couldn't erase the fear that had gripped the community for so long. She had caught the killer, but she had also learned a terrible truth: that evil could wear the most ordinary faces, could hide behind respected positions and friendly smiles, could exist in plain sight while everyone looked past it. Dr. Robert Harding had almost gotten away with it. If not for that one graduate student's courage to come forward, if not for that momentary crack in his facade during the interview, if not for the dogged persistence of investigators who refused to let the case go cold, he would have continued killing. And somewhere in America, Sarah knew there were other predators like him, hiding behind professional credentials and community trust, waiting for their opportunities. The trial would come later. The conviction was virtually certain. But the real work? Healing a community, restoring faith in institutions designed to protect young people, ensuring this could never happen again. That work was just beginning. The trial of Dr. Robert Harding began on October 15, 2012. In the Gallatin County Courthouse. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Chen, had spent 6 months building an airtight case. The evidence was overwhelming: DNA linking Harding to all 3 victims, the photographs and trophies found in his cabin, the detailed journals documenting his crimes, testimony from dozens of witnesses establishing opportunity and means. Detective Sarah Brennan sat in the courtroom every day, watching as the case she had built was presented to a jury of 12 citizens who would decide Harding's fate. The defendant sat at the defense table in a suit and tie, his expression composed, occasionally taking notes or whispering to his attorneys. To anyone who didn't know better, he could have been attending a faculty meeting rather than fighting for his life. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Dr. Patricia Chen, the medical examiner, testified about the injuries sustained by each victim, the brutality of the attacks, the suffering endured before death. Forensic experts explained the DNA evidence, the fiber analysis, the soil samples that placed Harding at each dump site. Campus security testified about the camera malfunctions that had occurred with suspicious timing. But it was the testimony of Amanda Torres, the graduate student who had narrowly escaped becoming victim number 4, that brought the horror of Harding's crimes into sharp focus. "He was my mentor," Amanda said from the witness stand, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I trusted him completely. I went to his office for advice, asked him to write recommendation letters, spent hours in his lab learning research techniques, and the whole time, he was planning to kill me. I saw my photograph in that cabin. Detective Brennan showed it to me. He had been following me, documenting my routines, waiting for the right moment. If I hadn't been in that lab that night..." Her voice broke and the courtroom fell silent except for muffled sobs from the gallery where the victims' families sat. The defense strategy, such as it was, focused on creating reasonable doubt about Harding's intent and state of mind. His attorney, a seasoned criminal defense lawyer named Patricia Morse, didn't deny that the evidence was found in Harding's cabin. Instead, she suggested that Harding suffered from a dissociative disorder, that he had created the underground room and collected the items during blackout periods he couldn't recall. "Doctor, Harding has no memory of creating that space or collecting those photographs," Morse argued during her opening statement. "The man you see before you today is a respected educator who dedicated his life to science and teaching. The evidence suggests he suffers from a severe psychiatric condition that caused him to act in ways completely contrary to his conscious values and personality." It was a desperate defense, and Sarah could see the jury wasn't buying it. The journals were too detailed, too calculated. The planning was too meticulous. This wasn't the work of someone experiencing blackouts or dissociative episodes. This was the work of a cold, calculating predator who knew exactly what he was doing. On the trial's 4th day, the prosecution called Sarah to the stand. District Attorney Chen walked her through the investigation chronologically: the discovery of Emily Richardson's abandoned backpack, the finding of the bodies, the years of painstaking detective work that had finally led them to Harding. "Detective Brennan," Chen asked, "in your professional opinion based on 20 years of law enforcement experience, were these crimes committed impulsively, or were they planned?" Sarah looked directly at the jury as she answered, "These crimes were meticulously planned. The suspect disabled security cameras in advance. He selected victims whose schedules he could influence and predict. He maintained a secret location where he could take victims without fear of discovery. He cleaned crime scenes to avoid leaving DNA evidence, and he kept detailed records of his activities, documenting his selection process and execution of each murder. This level of planning is incompatible with any claim of diminished capacity or loss of control." During cross-examination, Patricia Morse tried to undermine Sarah's conclusions. "Detective, isn't it true that you initially focused on other suspects before identifying Dr. Harding? Doesn't that suggest the evidence against my client wasn't as clear-cut as you're now claiming?" Sarah remained calm, refusing to be rattled. "In any complex investigation, we examine multiple possibilities before identifying the correct suspect. That's not a weakness in our case, it's evidence of thorough professional police work. We didn't rush to judgment. We followed the evidence wherever it led, and it led conclusively to your client." The defense also called their own expert witnesses, psychiatrists who testified that Harding's behavior was consistent with dissociative identity disorder or other psychiatric conditions that could impair his judgment and memory. But on cross-examination, Chen dismantled their testimony by pointing out that none of these experts had examined Harding until after his arrest, that their diagnoses were based solely on reviewing evidence rather than clinical observation, and that nothing in Harding's extensive medical history prior to his arrest suggested any psychiatric issues whatsoever. On the 8th day of trial, against the advice of his attorneys, Dr. Robert Harding took the stand in his own defense. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as he was sworn in. This was the first time anyone would hear directly from the man accused of these horrific crimes. Sarah leaned forward, studying his every movement, every expression. "Dr. Harding," Patricia Morse began gently, "can you tell the jury about your career as an educator?" Harding's voice was calm, professorial, as if lecturing to a classroom. "I've dedicated my life to teaching and research. For 18 years, I've worked with hundreds of students helping them achieve their academic goals. I've published over 30 peer-reviewed papers. I've served on university committees. Teaching isn't just my profession, it's my calling. Do you remember creating the underground room in your cabin? No, I don't. I have no memory of building that space or collecting those items. When Detective Brennan showed me the photographs from the search, I was as shocked as anyone. I can't explain how those things came to be in my property. Do you remember harming Emily Richardson, Ashley Morrison, or Jessica Palmer? No. Harding's voice carried what seemed like genuine anguish. I remember Emily as a bright student in my ecology class. I remember selecting Jessica for my research program because she showed exceptional promise. But I have no memory of hurting them or anyone else. The thought that I could have done these things while having no conscious awareness of them is terrifying. It was a carefully crafted performance, and Sarah had to admit it was effective. If she hadn't spent 18 months investigating this man, if she hadn't seen the cold calculation in his journals, if she hadn't observed that momentary crack in his facade during the interview, she might have found his testimony compelling. But then came Michael Chen's cross-examination, and everything changed. Chen approached the witness stand with a file folder, moving with deliberate slowness. Dr. Harding, you testified that you have no memory of creating the underground room in your cabin. Is that correct? That's correct. And yet you were able to give police the code to the electronic lock on the cabinet where victims' personal items were stored. How do you explain that? Harding hesitated, the first crack appearing in his composed demeanor. I don't know. Perhaps the code was something I used elsewhere. A number that came to mind when asked. Chen pulled a document from his folder. The code was 031492. Does that date mean anything to you? I don't recall. That's the date you successfully defended your doctoral dissertation at Cornell University. A significant moment in your life, wouldn't you say? One you'd be unlikely to choose randomly if you had no memory of creating the lock. The courtroom was silent. Sarah saw several jurors leaning forward, their attention riveted. Chen continued relentlessly. Let's talk about your journals, Dr. Harding. The ones found in your cabin, written in your handwriting containing detailed descriptions of selecting, stalking, and murdering 3 young women. You claim to have no memory of writing these entries? I don't remember writing them, no. Chen opened one of the journals, reading aloud. March 3, 2011. This entry describes your thoughts about Emily Richardson. You wrote, subject demonstrates excellent adherence to predictable patterns. Monday and Wednesday evenings, library until approximately 9:30 p.m. Thursday evenings, study group in biology building until variable times. Friday evenings, typically social activities off campus. Optimal window for acquisition appears to be Thursday evening between 9:30 and 10:15 p.m. Chen looked up. This is not the writing of someone experiencing blackouts or dissociative episodes. This is careful, methodical planning. Harding's composure was crumbling. I can't explain those entries. Can't or won't? Chen pressed. Dr. Harding, you're a scientist. You understand evidence and data. The forensic evidence places you at each crime scene. Your DNA was found on the victims. Their personal items were in your possession. Your detailed journals describe these crimes. And yet you're asking this jury to believe you had no awareness of any of this? I'm telling you what I remember, or rather what I don't remember. Chen walked to the prosecution table and picked up another folder. Let's discuss your computer, Dr. Harding. Forensic analysis of your personal laptop revealed that you researched methods of DNA evidence removal, techniques for disabling security cameras, and case studies of serial killers who successfully evaded detection for years. This research was conducted over a 3-year period beginning in 2009. Does someone suffering from dissociative blackouts conduct years of research planning crimes they're not consciously aware they're going to commit? Harding had no answer. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating predator beneath. Chen pressed his advantage. You're not suffering from any psychiatric disorder, are you, Dr. Harding? You knew exactly what you were doing. You planned these murders meticulously. You used your position of trust and authority to select vulnerable victims. You exploited their admiration and respect for you as their professor. You're not sick, you're evil. Objection. Patricia Morse was on her feet. Argumentative and calls for speculation. Sustained, Judge Williams ruled. Mr. Chen, rephrase. But the damage was done. The jury had seen Harding unable to explain away the evidence, unable to maintain his facade of confused innocence when confronted with the cold facts of his crimes. The cross-examination continued for another hour. with Chen systematically destroying every element of Harding's defense. By the time the prosecutor finished, Harding looked exhausted, his carefully maintained composure shattered. The closing arguments came 2 days later. Michael Chen delivered a powerful summation of the evidence, reminding the jury of the 3 young women whose lives had been stolen, of the families destroyed, of the community terrorized. Emily Richardson wanted to work in conservation, Chen said, his voice resonating through the courtroom. Ashley Morrison dreamed of becoming a biochemist. Jessica Palmer was accepted into medical school. All 3 had bright futures ahead of them. All 3 trusted the defendant because he was their professor, their mentor, someone they believed cared about their success. And he used that trust to hunt them like animals, to torture and kill them, to dispose of their bodies in the wilderness like trash. The evidence is overwhelming and incontrovertible. Dr. Robert Harding is guilty of 3 counts of premeditated murder, and justice demands that you find him so. Patricia Morse's closing argument was subdued, acknowledging the strength of the evidence while making one final plea for the jury to consider the possibility of psychiatric impairment. But even she seemed to know it was hopeless. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom at 4:30 p.m. on October 29th, their expressions told Sarah everything she needed to know. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Williams asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson, a middle-aged woman who worked as a high school teacher, replied. She handed a slip of paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Judge Williams reviewed it silently, then looked at the defendant. "Will the defendant please rise?" Harding stood, flanked by his attorneys. For the first time since his arrest, Sarah saw fear in his eyes. "On the count of murder in the first degree of Emily Richardson, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the count of murder in the first degree of Ashley Morrison, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the count of murder in the first degree of Jessica Palmer, how do you find?" "Guilty." The courtroom erupted. Family members of the victims sobbed with relief. Reporters rushed for the exits to file their stories. Sarah felt tears streaming down her own face. Not tears of joy, but of profound sadness for lives that should never have been lost. Judge Williams banged her gavel, restoring order. "Sentencing will be scheduled for December 3rd. The defendant will remain in custody without bail. This court is adjourned." As Harding was led away in handcuffs, he turned and looked directly at Sarah. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that exchange, Sarah saw no remorse, no regret, no humanity. She saw only cold calculation, and perhaps a hint of satisfaction that his crimes would be remembered, studied, discussed in criminal justice courses for years to come. He had wanted to be more than a biology professor. He had wanted to be extraordinary, memorable, significant, and in the most horrific way possible, he had succeeded. Sarah left the courthouse as evening fell over Bozeman, the autumn air carrying the first real bite of approaching winter. The case was closed. Justice had been served. But as she drove through the streets of the town she'd sworn to protect, past the university where 3 young women had once walked, studied, dreamed, and lived, she knew that some wounds would never fully heal. The families would carry their grief forever. The community would rebuild its sense of safety slowly, carefully, never quite trusting as easily as before. And Sarah would carry the weight of those 18 months, the near misses, the dead ends, the nights she'd almost given up, the other potential victims who had come so close to death. In December, Dr. Robert Harding was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion as the sentence was delivered, accepting his fate with the same detached calm he'd displayed throughout the trial. Sarah attended the sentencing but left immediately afterward, unable to stomach the sight of him any longer. She had done her job. She had brought justice for Emily, Ashley, and Jessica. Now she needed to find a way to move forward, to return to normal investigations, to remember that most of the world was still decent and good. But she knew she would never forget Dr. Robert Harding, or the terrible lesson his case had taught, that evil often wears the most trusted faces, and that vigilance, persistence, and courage are the only weapons we have against it. 12 years passed. Detective Sarah Brennan retired from the Bozeman Police Department in 2018 at the age of 54, after 32 years of service. She'd solved dozens of cases in the years following Harding's conviction, but none haunted her like the serial case 2010. She left law enforcement with commendations and the respect of her peers, but she took with her something else, an obsession that refused to fade with time. By 2024, Sarah lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of Bozeman, her days filled with consulting work for cold case units across Montana, and volunteer work with victims' advocacy groups. Her ex-husband had remarried years ago. Her daughter, now 31, lived in Seattle with her own family. Sarah's life had become quiet, orderly, focused on the cases that still needed solving. But the Harding case never truly left her mind. She kept copies of all the files in her home office, and on sleepless nights, which came more frequently as she aged, she would pore over them again, looking for answers to questions that had never been fully resolved. The question that tormented her most was simple but devastating. Were there others? Dr. Robert Harding had taught at 3 universities over 18 years. He'd had access to hundreds of young women, countless opportunities. Emily Richardson, Ashley Morrison, and Jessica Palmer were the only victims they'd been able to prove, but Sarah's instincts told her there had been others. The sophistication of his methods, the careful planning, the complete lack of remorse, these weren't the characteristics of someone who had suddenly started killing in 2010. In the years since Harding's conviction, Sarah had maintained contact with police departments in Oregon and Colorado, where Harding had previously taught. She'd reviewed missing person reports from those time periods, looking for cases that matched his pattern. Several young women had disappeared from areas near both universities during Harding's tenure, but without bodies or evidence, the connections remained speculative. On a cold morning in January 2024, Sarah sat at her kitchen table reading about a breakthrough in DNA technology. A new technique called forensic genetic genealogy had been used to solve a 40-year-old murder case in California. The technology could extract viable DNA from evidence that had previously been considered too degraded or contaminated for analysis. An idea began forming in her mind, an idea that would consume the next year of her life. Sarah called Marcus Webb, who had risen to the rank of lieutenant and now headed the detective division at the Bozeman Police Department. They'd remained close friends after her retirement, meeting monthly for coffee to discuss cases and life. "Marcus, I need a favor," Sarah said without preamble when he answered. "I want to retest evidence from the Harding case using new DNA technology." There was a long pause. "Sarah, Harding's in prison for life. The case is closed. What are you hoping to find?" "I think there were other victims. Women who disappeared from Oregon and Colorado when Harding taught there. Women whose cases went cold because we didn't have the technology to analyze degraded evidence. If we could extract DNA from those old cases and compare it to Harding's profile, that's a huge undertaking," Marcus interrupted gently. "It would require reopening multiple jurisdictions' cold cases, getting permission to retest evidence, coordinating with labs that are already backlogged for months, and even if you found matches after 12 years, prosecuting new cases would be difficult." "I'm not looking to prosecute," Sarah said quietly. "Harding's never getting out. But those families deserve answers. They deserve to know what happened to their daughters, their sisters. They deserve closure." Marcus sighed, but Sarah could hear the resignation in his voice. He knew her well enough to understand that once she'd latched onto an idea, she wouldn't let it go. "All right, let me see what I can do. But Sarah, don't get your hopes up. This is a long shot." What Marcus didn't say, but what they both understood, was that this quest had become Sarah's way of dealing with guilt. Guilt that she hadn't identified Harding sooner. Guilt over the months when she'd deprioritized him as a suspect while he remained free. Guilt over the women who might still be alive if she'd been smarter, faster, more persistent. Over the next 6 months, Sarah worked tirelessly to coordinate with law enforcement agencies in Oregon and Colorado. She identified 7 missing person cases from the time periods when Harding had taught at those universities. Young women between the ages of 19 and 23, who had vanished without trace between 2000 and 2008. The Oregon cases included 2 students from Willamette University in Salem, Jennifer Hartley, who disappeared in 2003, and Michelle Owens, who vanished in 2005. Both women had been biology majors. Both had been last seen leaving campus in the evening. Neither had ever been found. The Colorado cases were more numerous. 5 women had disappeared from areas near Colorado State University and Fort Collins between 2006 and 2008. Rachel Kim, Brittany Lawson, Samantha Torres, Nicole Chen, and Christina Martinez. All were students. All disappeared during evening hours. All remained missing. Sarah created a new case board in her home office, covering an entire wall with photographs of these 7 women alongside Emily, Ashley, and Jessica. 10 young faces staring back at her. 10 families waiting for answers. The breakthrough came in July 2024. The Oregon State Police Forensics Lab agreed to retest evidence from Jennifer Hartley's case. using the new DNA extraction technology. Jennifer's backpack had been found abandoned near campus in 2003, with traces of what appeared to be blood on one of the straps. At the time, the sample had been too small and degraded for analysis, but with modern techniques, the lab was able to extract a partial DNA profile. When the results came back, Sarah's hands trembled as she read the report. The DNA profile was a match to Dr. Robert Harding. Within weeks, similar results came back from the other cases. Michelle Owens's jacket, found in a dumpster months after her disappearance, contained trace DNA matching Harding. Rachel Kim's apartment had yielded fingerprints on a window frame that had never been properly analyzed. They matched Harding's prints. One by one, the evidence connected him to 7 additional murders, spanning 8 years across 2 states. Sarah sat in her home office on a September evening, looking at the caseboard with tears streaming down her face. She had been right. There had been others. 10 women in total. 10 brilliant young lives stolen by a predator who had hidden behind academic credentials and professional respectability for nearly a decade. But vindication brought no joy, only a profound sadness for the families who had waited years for answers, and rage at a system that had allowed Harding to move between universities, to continue teaching and accessing vulnerable students, even after quiet concerns had been raised about his behavior. In October 2024, Sarah was invited to present her findings to a joint task force of law enforcement agencies from Montana, Oregon, and Colorado. She stood before a room full of detectives and FBI agents, many young enough to be her children, and walked them through 12 years of obsessive investigation. Dr. Robert Harding's killing spanned from at least 2003 to 2012, Sarah explained, using a laser pointer to highlight the timeline on her presentation. He developed his methods over time, becoming more sophisticated and careful. The early victims in Oregon showed less planning, opportunistic abductions with some evidence left behind. By the time he reached Colorado, he had refined his technique, and by Montana, he had perfected it to the point where we almost didn't catch him. A young detective from Fort Collins raised her hand. "Ms. Brennan, why didn't anyone connect these cases earlier? 7 women missing from 2 universities where the same professor taught. Shouldn't that have raised red flags?" It was the question Sarah had asked herself 1,000 times. Different jurisdictions, different time periods, and most critically, no bodies. Without bodies, these were missing person cases, not homicides. Missing persons don't get the same level of resources or interagency cooperation. And Harding was careful to space out his crimes, to move between states, to never establish an obvious pattern. He understood how law enforcement works, and he exploited the gaps in our systems. The presentation concluded with a recommendation that all 7 cold cases be officially cleared as homicides attributable to Robert Harding. It also included a broader call for reforms, better information sharing between universities about faculty concerns, mandatory reporting of suspicious behavior involving students, and improved communication between law enforcement jurisdictions regarding missing persons. In November 2024, Sarah made one final trip to the Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge, where Dr. Robert Harding was serving his sentence. She hadn't seen him since the sentencing hearing 12 years earlier, and she wasn't sure why she felt compelled to see him now. Perhaps she needed him to acknowledge the full scope of his crimes. Perhaps she needed to look him in the eye one more time and tell him that despite his best efforts, the truth had emerged. The prison interview room was stark and cold, separated by thick glass with phones for communication. Sarah sat on one side and waited. When Harding was escorted in, she was shocked by how much he had aged. He was 66 now, his hair completely white, his face deeply lined. Prison had not been kind to him. Harding picked up the phone on his side, and Sarah did the same. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other through the glass. "Detective Brennan," he said finally, his voice still carrying that professorial tone despite the circumstances. "I heard you've been busy reopening old cases. We know about the others," Sarah said quietly. "Jennifer, Michelle, Rachel, Brittany, Samantha, Nicole, Christina. 7 more women whose lives you destroyed. 10 in total. Did you really think you'd get away with it forever?" Something flickered across Harding's face, perhaps surprise, perhaps resignation. Modern technology is remarkable, isn't it? DNA extraction techniques have improved dramatically since my trial. Is that all you have to say? Sarah leaned forward, her voice sharp. 10 women are dead because of you. 10 families have been shattered. And you're commenting on forensic technology? Harding was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said something that chilled Sarah to her core. "You know what the irony is, Detective? I almost stopped after Jennifer. I actually felt something that time. Not quite remorse, but close to it. I told myself it was an aberration, that I wouldn't do it again. But then, 2 years passed, and the feeling faded, and Michelle was so eager to work in my lab, so trusting, and I realized I didn't want to stop. The planning, the execution, the sense of complete control over another person's fate. It was more compelling than any research I'd ever conducted." "You're a monster," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a human being who discovered he had no conscience," Harding replied with disturbing calm. "Do you know how rare that is? To look inside yourself and find nothing, no guilt, no empathy, no connection to other people's humanity. I found it fascinating. I still do." Sarah wanted to scream at him, to break through the glass and make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused. But she forced herself to remain professional, to remember why she'd come. "The families of your victims, all 10 of them, they're getting closure now. They're learning what happened to their daughters. Your legacy isn't going to be that of a brilliant professor or a clever criminal. Your legacy is pain and suffering. You'll be forgotten except as a cautionary tale about the monsters that hide in plain sight." Harding smiled slightly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I'll be studied, analyzed, used as an example in criminal psychology courses. My journals have already been published in redacted form for law enforcement training. In a way, I achieved a kind of immortality. Isn't that what all academics secretly want?" Sarah hung up the phone without another word and walked out of the interview room. She had gotten what she came for, not an apology or expression of remorse, which she'd known would never come, but confirmation that every instinct she'd had about him was correct. Robert Harding was precisely what she'd always believed, a predator without conscience, a killer who had turned murder into his true life's work. In December 2024, Sarah organized a private memorial service in Bozeman for all 10 of Harding's victims. Families traveled from across the country to attend. The event was held at a small chapel on the outskirts of town, with 10 candles burning in memory of 10 lives stolen too soon. Sarah stood before the assembled families and spoke from her heart. "For 12 years I've carried these cases with me, the 3 we knew about and the 7 we suspected but couldn't prove. Today, because of advances in forensic science and the dedication of law enforcement professionals across multiple states, we can finally give you answers. We can finally let your daughters rest in peace, knowing that the truth has been uncovered and their stories have been told." Maria Torres, Samantha's mother, approached Sarah after the service with tears streaming down her face. "For 16 years I didn't know if my daughter had run away, if she'd been in an accident, if she was alive somewhere with amnesia. Not knowing was torture. Thank you for giving me certainty. Thank you for never giving up." As winter settled over Bozeman once again, Sarah Brennan finally allowed herself to close the chapter on the case that had defined so much of her life. The case board came down from her office wall. The files were boxed up and donated to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit for training purposes. The weight she'd carried for 14 years didn't disappear entirely, but it became more bearable. On a clear January morning in 2025, Sarah drove out to the Bridger Mountains, to a spot overlooking the valleys where 3 of Harding's victims had been found. A small memorial plaque had been installed there bearing the names of all 10 women. She stood in the cold, looking out at the vast Montana landscape, and said a quiet prayer for the young women whose futures had been stolen. She thought about how Harding had used his intelligence, his position, and his understanding of human nature to become one of Montana's most prolific serial killers. She thought about the near misses, the times he'd almost been caught, the women who had survived only through chance or circumstance, but mostly she thought about the families who could finally begin to heal, who could finally say goodbye to daughters, sisters, and friends whose fates had remained unknown for so long. That was what made the years of obsessive investigation worthwhile. Not revenge, not even justice in the traditional sense, but the simple human need for truth and closure. As Sarah drove back to Bozeman, she noticed a group of young women walking across the Montana State campus, laughing and talking, their whole lives ahead of them. The university had implemented major reforms since Harding's conviction: better security, improved reporting systems, mandatory training for all faculty on appropriate boundaries with students. The campus was safer now, more vigilant. But Sarah knew that safety was always relative, that predators would always exist, that the price of security was eternal vigilance. The best she could hope for was that her work, both in catching Harding and in uncovering the full scope of his crimes, would serve as a reminder to future investigators. Never stop questioning, never accept easy answers, and never underestimate the monsters hiding behind respectable facades. The case of Dr. Robert Harding was finally, truly closed. 10 victims identified, justice served, a community healed, slowly but surely, and one retired detective could finally rest, knowing she had kept her promise to 3 young women who had died in 2010 and 2011, and to 7 others whose names she hadn't even known when she'd made that promise. She had found the truth, and in the end, that was all any detective could hope to do.